The man known to history as Otto Strasser was born on the 10th of September 1897 in the town of Bad Windsheim in the Bavaria region of southern Germany, not far from Nuremberg and Munich. His full name was Otto Johann Maximilian Strasser. His father was Peter Strasser, a judicial official who worked in the courts in Upper Bavaria. Peter was a Roman Catholic, a common religious affiliation in the Bavaria region. Hailing from a farming background initially, he was the first of his family to enter an administrative and official position, and eventually rose fairly high in the judicial system within Bavaria. Otto's mother was Paulina Strasser, née Strobel. She had married Peter in 1891. Otto had 4 other siblings born to Peter and Paulina. Of these, the most important in his story was his older brother Gregor, born in 1892, 5 years before Otto. He had 2 other brothers, Paul, born in 1895, who would become a Benedictine monk and move to the United States in later life, and the youngest of the brood, Anton, a notary in the civil law courts who died many years later fighting on the Eastern Front against the Soviet Union in 1943. They had one sister named Olga. Very few concrete details about her life are known, though she evidently lived a long life, as Otto ended up staying with her for a time after he returned to Germany in the mid-1950s, after many years abroad. Otto's youth was a comfortably middle-class one by the standards of the time, his father's position affording the Strassers a good life in Bavaria. He and his brothers attended a mix of different schools, while also being partially educated by local Jesuits in line with the Strassers' firm Catholicism. Otto and Gregor would both develop into politically involved individuals. It appears that much of this came from their father Peter. Discussions around the Strasser dinner table were about politics and civil life, and in 1912 Otto's father published a book which he called The New Way, an expression of his political views which displayed his antipathy towards the capitalism that had changed Germany dramatically during his lifetime as the Second Industrial Revolution transformed the German Empire, while also incorporating elements of what we might call Christian socialism. It is hard to escape the idea that the Strasser brothers' political outlook was forged in their childhood home. It was a youth also lived against a backdrop of growing antagonism around Europe. Ever since the unification of Germany and the formation of the German Empire in 1871, a rivalry had developed between Germany and Britain, while Germany's ally, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, was involved in an increasingly fraught clash with the Russian Empire for influence in the Balkans. It eventually all boiled over in the summer of 1914 as a result of a diplomatic crisis which followed from the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, the heir to the Austro-Hungarian Empire, in the streets of Sarajevo by a Serb nationalist, Gavrilo Princip. Otto was still just 16 years of age when the First World War erupted in the final days of July 1914 and the first days of August. Despite his young age, in a spirit of nationalist fervor, he joined the German Imperial Army within days of the fighting commencing, as had his older brother Gregor. Otto would later claim, perhaps with some legitimacy, that he was the youngest volunteer to sign up to serve in Bavaria in 1914. Regardless of his youth, he served with very considerable distinction over the next 4 years, on various fronts in France and elsewhere. He was first assigned to the 20th Reserve Regiment of the Bavarian Army, units of the Imperial Army still being divided according to the federal divisions of the German Empire. Later he was transferred to the 1st Bavarian Artillery Army. He was wounded on several occasions and was awarded several honors for his service, including the Iron Cross First Class for bravery in combat and the Military Order of Max Joseph. The latter was the most prestigious award granted by the Bavarian military, though he would never actually receive the honor. With the end of the First World War, the federal states and kingdoms that made up the German Empire, including the Kingdom of Bavaria, came to an end, and there was now no Bavarian federal kingdom to award him the military order of Max Joseph. Strasser was wounded and in a hospital in Munich as the First World War was coming to an end in November 1918, on the back of revolts and unrest across Germany, which led to the abdication of the Kaiser, Wilhelm II, and the collapse of the German Empire. In one of his many autobiographical books written decades later, he describes the hospital as being little more than a butcher's shop for the wounded and maimed at the end of 4 years of bloodshed. Here, patients subsisted on a diet of substitute coffee made from acorns and butter, bulked out with carrot puree. Such were the dire straits of the German economy at the end of the war. In the first months of 1919, communist revolts sprung up in Berlin, Munich, and elsewhere, with left-wing radical socialists condemning the war that Strasser had fought in. When he was discharged from hospital, he immediately joined the Freikorps, an unofficial militia of the new German Republic that was used in 1919 and 1920 to crush the socialist revolts. Eventually, some signs of normal life began to return to Germany, although many parts of the country and Europe more broadly were in disarray until 1923 and 1924, with revolutions and civil wars in roughly half of the continent's countries in the post-war era. For Strasser, this gradualist return to normality involved him as a war veteran of 21 years of age recommencing his high school studies that had been abandoned back in 1914. He quickly graduated and then headed to the University of Berlin, followed by a stint at the University of Würzburg. There is a shadowy element to all of this. Strasser allegedly graduated from Würzburg in 1921 with a doctorate, but exactly what this might have been in and how he could have attained a doctoral degree in such a short period of time is unclear. Some sources suggest he was studying the law at Würzburg, yet his subsequent employment in a junior position with the Ministry of Food does not seem to tally with this, and his doctoral studies, limited as they were, might have been in something like economics or agricultural studies. He remained politically active while at university, claiming later that he founded the National Union of Students, a center-right organization. During these years, Otto was not yet a member of any of the numerous radical right-wing parties that had emerged in Bavaria and elsewhere after the war, many of them comprised of war veterans who had gone on to become members of the Freikorps. Instead, he was initially a supporter of the moderate Social Democratic Party and its leader, Friedrich Ebert, who served as the first president of the post-war Weimar Republic between 1919 and 1925. He claimed to have aided the government in suppressing the Kapp Putsch in Berlin in March 1920, and this is largely corroborated by other sources. However, he soon began to become disillusioned with Ebert and the Social Democrats. This shift in Strasser's political outlook came about as a result of the occupation of the Ruhr industrial region of Western Germany by the French and Belgians from January 1923 in retaliation for the failure of Germany to meet the onerous war reparations payments which had been imposed on it as part of the Treaty of Versailles that brought the war to an end in 1919. The occupation of the Ruhr would last for 2.5 years down to the autumn of 1925, a period in which French and Belgian troops effectively controlled parts of Western Germany. Strasser and many others rejected the Social Democrats for their seeming inability to resist the Franco-Belgian occupation. According to Otto in his many writings in later years, he was first approached to consider becoming a member of the National Socialist German Workers' Party in 1920, just a few months after it had been first established as one of the plethora of new political parties emerging during the chaotic period that followed the collapse of the German Empire. This initial foray into Nazi politics came about through Otto's elder brother Gregor, one of the earliest members of the party. It was Gregor who approached Otto in 1920, and called him to a meeting where he was introduced to Adolf Hitler and General Erich Ludendorff, the latter being one of the heroes of Germany's war effort in the mid-1910s. Otto demurred from joining the nascent Nazi Party at this juncture, instead continuing his affiliation with the Social Democratic Party. Hence, he was not involved in the Munich Putsch, through which the Nazis tried to seize control of Munich and then Bavaria in early November 1923, a disastrous insurrection which collapsed after a few hours and led to the imprisonment of many leading figures in the party, including Hitler, and the temporary breaking up of the organization by the Bavarian authorities. Yet, in one of the most ill-conceived acts of clemency in human history, in late 1924 and early 1925, Hitler was released from prison after serving a pitiful few months of his sentence, and the Nazis were allowed to re-establish themselves as a political party. It was shortly after this, in 1925, that Otto joined the Nazis, at a time when he had become utterly disillusioned by the Social Democrats and other mainstream parties. The exact details of Otto's role with the Nazis in the second half of the 1920s and his earlier flirtations with the party are difficult to assess accurately. This was an era in which the Nazis were a non-entity in wider German politics, having little more than a small base of support in Bavaria. Because of this, there is often a lack of official sources for assessing what went on amongst the Nazis in these early years, and we are unduly reliant on first-hand accounts by members of the Nazis themselves. In Otto's case, he is the best source for his own life, having written over a dozen books, many of them autobiographical and carrying names like Hitler and I. While these provide extensive details of his early life and career in the Nazis, they need to be handled cautiously. Otto was fond of self-mythologizing and bending facts to portray himself in the best light possible. A sign of how dubious the accuracy of some of his memoirs might be is that they often contradicted each other. For instance, in one of his books, Otto will describe an event from around 1925 or 1926 in one way, and then in another book, published several years later, he presents a different account. Clearly, there are kernels of truth to the events he describes, but they are not entirely accurate historical accounts. Otto's role in the Nazi Party between 1925 and 1930 was very varied. When the party was re-established in 1925, it was so with a determination to come to power by gaining seats in local and national government, rather than through the kind of violent insurrection which had proved so disastrous in November 1923. To this end, Otto was central to efforts to try and expand the party beyond its small but committed base of support in the Munich region, to other parts of Germany, in northern Bavaria and beyond. He and Gregor were in charge here of what was to become known as the northern faction of National Socialism in the 1920s. His other principal role was in promoting the party, along with Gregor through various media outlets and events, organizing public meetings and rallies, distributing leaflets and publishing newsletters and newspapers. One of these, for instance, was the Nationalsozialistische Briefe, or National Socialist Brief, a review newspaper published every 2 weeks on various aspects of German politics and society. These publications soon established the Strasser brothers as two figures within the Nazi movement who were intent on pushing an approach to German politics that differed somewhat from Hitler's. Otto and Gregor formed a part of the Nazi Party in the second half of the 1920s, which has spawned the term Strasserism, to describe how they differed from the faction of the party led by Hitler. While the party would become ideologically opposed to socialist projects such as Bolshevism and communism, and viewed the Soviet Union as its mortal enemy in Europe, they were not above using the popularity of socialism to promote their own agenda. We see this in the very name of the movement, National Socialism. Superficially, the Nazis presented a strange blend of radical left and right-wing politics in their early days. They were staunch conservatives and nationalists when it came to society, German traditions and Germany's place in Europe, who also constructed a critique of specific aspects of capitalism in order to further their anti-Semitic project, arguing that Jewish people operating with capitalism had contributed to Germany's defeat and humiliation during and after the First World War. No one in the Nazi movement in the 1920s epitomized this anti-capitalist stance more than Otto Strasser, and it became the hallmark of Strasserism, whereas Hitler emphasized the national part of the equation. While Strasserism might have differed from the Nazism of Hitler and his faction, there should be no doubt that Otto and his brother shared the anti-Semitism of their National Socialist colleagues. For Strasser and his brother Gregor, they viewed the Jewish people as being pillars of the capitalist establishment, which they wanted to diminish the power of through their brand of National Socialism. He regularly expressed anti-Semitic sentiments throughout his life well into the 1950s and 1960s. However, at the same time, his outlook was certainly not as extreme as that of Hitler, and those like Heinrich Himmler, the head of the SS, who oversaw the Holocaust. Consider, for instance, his statement early on in the Second World War that, quote, "I have expressed the utmost disapproval of the shameless and inhumane anti-Jewish campaign that has characterized the Hitler system, and I may also mention that as early as 1928, in a party periodical, I protested editorially against anti-Semitism of the Streicher brand." All of this may seem to paint Otto in a more positive light, but it should be noted that in publishing these remarks in 1940, he did so in a section of a book which he entitled with the phrase, "The Jewish Problem." Strasser's views on the Jewish people of Europe were not as extreme as the Hitlerite wing of National Socialism, but he was an anti-Semite all the same. The divisions between the Strasserite wing of the party and Hitler and his faction reached a peak early in 1926 and led to the convening of the Bamberg Conference in the town of that name on the 14th of February 1926. The gathering was called by Hitler, ostensibly with the goal of creating uniformity on policy issues which were threatening to split the party into two Strasserite and Hitlerite factions, with Otto and Gregor and their followers taking over some of the more northerly branches of the party and Hitler controlling the southern branches in Munich and southern Bavaria. A new 25-point program was proposed as the established view of the party on matters relating to social and economic policy, the main dividing line between the Strasserites and the Hitlerites. According to Otto's later account of these events, the meeting was intentionally held on a weekday in order to prevent members of the northern branches of the party attending and so ensuring Hitler's victory at Bamberg. This again points towards the dubious accuracy of Otto's writings. The 14th of February 1926 was a Sunday, not a weekday. This suggests that he was trying to disguise the fact that Hitler simply managed to win more support at Bamberg. It was a key moment in the early history of the Nazi Party, and from the spring of 1926, Hitler was in a more powerful position as important members of the movement during these years, such as the future Reich propaganda minister, Joseph Goebbels, switched their allegiances to support him fully. While Gregor was more willing to accept defeat after the Bamberg Conference and would eventually step back from any involvement in the Nazi Party in years to come, Otto was more vocal in trying to resist Hitler even after his power grab in 1926. He still controlled substantial publishing operations and was able to use these to promote his ideas. He spent much of 1927 and 1928 locked in a rivalry with Goebbels over control over various Nazi newspapers and media outlets. As this former ally of the Strasser brothers became one of Otto's most prominent nemeses. Eventually, matters boiled over at the end of the 1920s and early 1930. Otto was unwilling to accept Hitler's decision to start courting some of the wealthy businessmen and industrialists who controlled much of the German economy through large steel, manufacturing, pharmaceutical and engineering companies. This came to a head early in 1930 when Hitler positioned the party to support the capitalist establishment in breaking up major strikes which were gripping the country at the beginning of the Great Depression. Such action was the antithesis of everything Otto believed National Socialism should stand for. After a meeting with Hitler in Berlin early that summer, it seemed that Otto would be expelled from the party. He jumped before he was pushed, resigning his position and leaving the Nazis in July 1930. Strasser now began establishing his own new party, even as Goebbels put the Nazi media outlets to work attacking him, accusing Otto of being a Bolshevik communist and an agent of Joseph Stalin's government in Moscow. The new party Strasser set up was called the Kampfgemeinschaft Revolutionärer Nationalsozialisten, translating as the Fighting Community of Revolutionary National Socialists, a name which was obviously designed as a reproach to the Hitlerites and a statement of Strasser's view that he now represented the original mission of National Socialism. His new party is more commonly known today as the Black Front. It would be in operation in Germany for the next 2.5 years. Otto attracted a small cohort of dissident Nazi members to his cause, though it was always a relatively minor movement, one which would gain more notoriety in later years outside of Germany than it ever did within the country between 1930 and 1933. One of its primary activities during these early years was publishing a newspaper called The German Revolution, which sought to assail Hitler and his growing popularity. Soon, Germany would no longer be safe for Strasser and his efforts to establish the Black Front. Right around the time he broke from the Nazis, the party was entering into a period of unprecedented popularity. The Wall Street crash and the Great Depression that followed it for years in the early 1930s hit Germany hard, as its banks were particularly exposed, and it had the added burden of the war reparations payments. In the Reichstag elections of September 1930, the Nazis had become the second largest party in Germany, and 2 years later, in fresh elections, they became the party with the strongest amount of support amongst German voters, by quite some margin. Despite their reservations, the centre-right establishment caved to Hitler's demands to be made German Chancellor in January 1933, and within weeks democracy in Germany was dead, and the Nazis were in complete control of the state. Sensing he was now in danger, Otto fled over the border to Austria. He could only remain here briefly. The rise to power of the Nazis was immediately followed by efforts to use the Austrian branches of National Socialism to overthrow the Austrian government and unite Germany and Austria straight away into a Greater Germany in the course of 1933 and 1934, though they would eventually fail in this during these years. As these developments occurred, Strasser decided Austria was also not a safe haven, and in the summer of 1933, he crossed over the border to Czechoslovakia, a country where he knew the government would be unlikely to cave to Hitler's demands to hand him over to them. Not everyone was as fortunate as Otto Strasser. While the events of the spring of 1933 had created a one-party state in Germany ruled by the Nazis, the process whereby the country was turned into a totalitarian dictatorship ruled by Hitler was more gradual than is sometimes appreciated. For instance, as late as 1938, Hitler was still trying to acquire complete control over the German military from fractious elements within its high command. In the first 2 years after seizing power, he faced a potentially even stronger threat from the SA, the paramilitary wing of the Nazis, which had swelled to millions of members under Ernst Röhm's leadership. He eventually decided to act against Röhm. In the course of 3 days between the 30th of June 1934 and the 2nd of July, attacks were launched all over Germany against Röhm and other potential threats to Hitler's control over the Nazis. The Night of the Long Knives, as this period became known, was also a time for settling old scores. On the 30th of June, secret police of the Gestapo arrived at Otto's brother Gregor's home in Berlin and asked him to accompany them to a police station. Although he had almost entirely left politics by that time, Hitler and others had decided to remove any threat which Strasser might pose to their control. He was shot in a police cell shortly after being detained and left to bleed to death. The first news of his death was when Otto's sister-in-law, Gregor's wife, had an urn containing his cremated remains delivered to her. Otto was enraged in Czechoslovakia when he learned of his brother's murder at the hands of the Nazis. He began escalating his attacks against Hitler's regime using a radio program he was operating from the country. the most powerful mass communication medium other than the newspapers of the time. In a move which was somewhat at odds with his own expressed anti-Semitism, Strasser also developed contacts with some Jewish groups in Czechoslovakia and Germany that were determined to resist the Nazis, especially so after the passage of the most severe wave of the Nuremberg Laws in September 1935, measures which essentially stripped Germany's Jews of their citizenship and rights. The Nazis did not passively tolerate Strasser's actions from over the border in Czechoslovakia. Reinhard Heydrich, a rising ideological fanatic within the security forces and SS, who would one day end up governing much of Czechoslovakia on behalf of the Nazis, launched covert operations in 1934 to try to destroy the radio transmitter Strasser and his allies were using in Prague. He employed secret agents to this effect, and Heydrich was also involved in efforts to assassinate Strasser in the Czech capital for most of the remainder of the 1930s, though they proved unsuccessful. Otto also faced legal difficulties from the Czech authorities operating what was an illegal transmitter. In one of his later writings, he claimed that he had been sentenced to 2 years hard labor for doing so through the Prague courts, but that the sentence was suspended. In the second half of the 1930s, Strasser continued to operate from Prague, trying to grow the Black Front and promote his anti-Hitlerian message. He spent much time working with a German Jewish student by the name of Helmut Hirsch, who spent time in Prague before returning to Germany with grand ideas of inspiring a popular revolt against the regime. It failed entirely, and Hirsch was arraigned before the German courts and sentenced to be executed. The story created quite a stir in the international press, as Hirsch had dual American and German citizenship. By the time Hirsch was executed, Strasser had become more vocal in his warnings that the Germans were preparing speedily for war and that this would tear Europe apart. He was correct in this. If Britain, France, and others needed any confirmation of his assertions, they need not have looked much further than the German takeover of Austria in the spring of 1938 to create the Greater Germany, which they had failed to implement back in 1933 and 1934, and which had led to Strasser's initial flight to Czechoslovakia. Otto was aware that Czechoslovakia was becoming increasingly unsafe for him to be in, and by the time of the Anschluss between Germany and Austria, he had moved his family to Switzerland. He visited them there in the autumn of 1938, though continued to operate mainly out of Prague himself. Strasser's family life is something of a mystery. He had married some years earlier and had 2 children, a son and a daughter, but there are markedly few details concerning them from a man who was otherwise so fond of writing about himself. Before long, he would leave them in Switzerland and would not see them for many years. While in Switzerland in the autumn of 1938, Strasser was approached by a man in disguise who claimed to be a German general. The circumstances of this meeting remain frustratingly limited. Was the man part of some opposition movement to Hitler within the German military? This might make sense, given that Hitler had only earlier that year tightened his grip on the German armed forces by purging some of its leading figures and replacing them with more biddable generals. Perhaps this mysterious figure was opposed to these moves. All we can say for certain is that the general wanted to know if the Czechs would resist Nazi efforts to seize the German-speaking Sudetenland in Czechoslovakia, the status of which, even at the time this secretive meeting occurred, was being debated at a conference at Munich by Hitler, Benito Mussolini, Neville Chamberlain, and Édouard Daladier. When the Munich conference concluded, the Sudetenland was given to Germany in return for a wider European peace. The promise of no further conflict was empty, and in March 1939, the Germans occupied the rest of Czechoslovakia and then began making claims on Polish land. The latter move would lead to the outbreak of the Second World War, when Germany invaded Poland in the first hours of September 1939. For Strasser, these developments led to his decision to preemptively leave Czechoslovakia in anticipation of a full German takeover of the country, following which he knew he would be one of the foremost targets of the new Nazi government there. He began preparing to leave the country he had lived in since 1933. as soon as the Munich Agreement in September 1938 was in place, and had chartered a plane to fly to France long before the broader German annexation of Czechoslovakia in March 1939. In Paris, he set up a new office for the Black Front to continue his warnings about Hitler even as Europe was descending into war. An unusual development occurred shortly after he arrived in Paris when the German Foreign Minister, Joachim von Ribbentrop, negotiated an agreement with the French to respect each other's borders in December 1938. This was a meaningless piece of paper in retrospect, though it did give the Germans leverage to demand the detention of Strasser. Alarmed, he absconded from Paris before he could be arrested and joined his family in Switzerland. He was here when the war broke out in September 1939, though he had to leave again before long as the Nazis used an attempted assassination of Hitler during the Munich Putsch annual commemoration events in November 1939 to try to pressure the Swiss government into handing Strasser over. There is no evidence that Strasser was in any way involved with the lone conspirator in Munich, Georg Elser, yet he still had to abandon his family, heading back to France where he was now confident of a more friendly reception after the outbreak of war. During this period, Strasser was completing one of his most well-known books, entitled Germany Tomorrow. It was published in the summer of 1940 and reflected on the war which had now started and whether it could be ended swiftly and a new kind of Germany ushered onto the world stage. This explored a wide range of issues which Strasser perceived would have to be addressed if Germany's problematic stance in Europe was to be remedied. With sections dealing with the question of Austrian unity and a Greater Germany, the issue of the Sudetenland in Czechoslovakia, and German claims on territory in northern Poland and the Baltic States region. Throughout, he condemned what he termed the Hitler system, and made it clear that any future peace that was agreed would have to resolve long-standing points of contention in Central Europe in a manner which treated the German people equitably. He was disdainful of the Versailles Agreement of 1919, referring to it as a 19th century peace settlement that had been employed to deal with a 20th century problem, with its emphasis on one set of great powers stripping land away from another major European state. In this, he was not altogether incorrect, though his wider proposals in Germany Tomorrow were premature in expecting that any peace could be obtained in the short run. Strasser was allegedly being detained even as he was making the final revisions to the text of Germany Tomorrow for publication. Although, as with so much else about his movements during this period, Strasser is our primary source regarding the events of his own life and was sometimes unreliable in the way he related them. He claims that in May 1940 he was arrested by the French government and held in a detention camp as a potential German fifth columnist. It's hard to reconcile this with the fact that the French authorities would have known he was one of the leading German critics of the Nazis and Hitler. He went on to claim that the government in Paris thought better of it within a few weeks, and by late May he was free again, even as German troops were spreading out across northern France and closing on Paris after invading the country right around the time Strasser was first detained on the 10th of May 1940. He tried to make his way to Switzerland, but the border had been closed as a result of the Italian declaration of war on France on the 10th of June. He therefore spent the next several weeks moving around the ports of western France, attempting to board a ship out of the country, eventually managing to do so on board a liner headed for the Dutch colony of Curaçao in the Caribbean. Through a series of events, he finally ended up in the British colony of Bermuda, and from there took a ship for Canada, where he made his base in early 1941. Over the next 4 years of the war, Strasser would become known within the Canadian media as the Prisoner of Ottawa, a reference to his inability to leave Canada. He received financial aid from his brother Paul, who was living as a Benedictine monk in the United States by that time. Otherwise, he petitioned both the Canadians and the British for a stipend, arguing that his role in leading what he now called the Free Germany movement was vital to Allied interests in the fight against the Nazis. He also wrote extensively during these years, both articles condemning the Nazi regime and urging an uprising against Hitler, and also revising a series of books which he had first published in the 1930s. For instance, the German St. Bartholomew's Night had compared the Night of Long Knives, in which his brother Gregor was killed, to the St. Bartholomew's Day massacres of Protestants in France back in 1572. All the while, there was a large bounty on his head. Hitler and the security forces back in Germany had branded Strasser as public enemy number 1 and were offering 1 million Reichsmarks for him. It was unspecified if they wanted him dead or alive. This might seem like a vague threat given his exile in Canada. However, the Germans did have agents operating in North America during the war, notably in the port precinct of New York City, and it was not unrealistic that they could have assassinated him in Canada. As well as his efforts to publish several books on Germany and the problem posed by the Hitler system, Strasser also gave numerous interviews to prominent newspapers and other media outlets during his Canadian exile. One of the most notorious was with an aging H.G. Wells, the science fiction writer and author of The War of the Worlds. The two men met while Strasser was briefly in Bermuda and clearly did not warm to each other. Wells afterwards published a disparaging article entitled Otto Strasser, an ally we don't want, in which he reported that Strasser had uttered numerous anti-Semitic statements while he was interviewing him. Strasser claimed of Wells that he seemed to be interested solely in trying to discover what he might know about Hitler's alleged sexual perversions. Interviews he undertook in Canada went more smoothly. One with a New Zealand newspaper, the Pahiatua Herald, focused on how anti-Hitlerian sentiment could be created in Germany through a systematic propaganda campaign by the Allies. His argument was that only 10% or so of the German people supported Hitler, something which was clearly untrue, though a useful lie for Strasser's purposes. Elsewhere, he commented on such matters as the strange decision by Rudolf Hess, one of the most powerful figures in the Nazi regime, to fly solo into Scotland in May 1941, allegedly to try to negotiate peace terms with the British. These and other ruminations by Strasser clearly made for curious reading for an Anglophone audience coming from somebody with a unique insight into the Nazi regime, though how much they might have impacted on strategic thinking in London or Washington on any level is open to debate. There was another reason why Strasser was allowed to live and operate like this in Canada during the war. The Canadian government was actually deeply unhappy about such a prominent member of the Nazis from the 1920s living freely in their country at this time. They only agreed to do so as pressure was applied by Prime Minister Winston Churchill's government in Britain. Churchill was anxious that Strasser be left unimpeded to continue his writing and other activity, all with the goal of potentially trying to appeal to elements within the German right wing to overthrow Hitler and the Nazis, particularly so as the war turned against the Germans in 1942 and 1943. And the possibility of insurrections within Germany became plausible. It was felt that Strasser, as a mouthpiece of German resistance to the Nazis living abroad, could be a useful tool to foment such resistance. At the same time, Churchill was wary of allowing Strasser to carry out any such activity from Britain itself. Therefore, once Strasser arrived to Canada, the British Prime Minister pressured the Canadians to let him work freely there, but also to make sure that he stayed in Canada. In the end, the wider plan had little tangible impact. The one major anti-Nazi revolt that emerged in Germany, the 20th of July plot in 1944, came from within the ranks of the German military, and Strasser was not a major influence of any kind on the plotters. Strasser would spend the rest of the war and well beyond its end in Canada. As time went by, the Allied governments lost interest in the possibility of utilizing him in some way to bend public opinion against Hitler and the Nazis in Germany. There were several reasons for this. Firstly, they simply realized over time that his claims that there was some sort of underground resistance in Germany that was waiting to be tapped into were just not true. Most of the people Strasser claimed as key associates in German politics were individuals who had long since left Germany and headed to South America to avoid falling prey to attacks such as those which had occurred years earlier during the Night of the Long Knives. More importantly, Churchill and others began to lose interest in employing Strasser in some fashion because they did not need to undermine German domestic morale anymore. The war shifted decidedly against the Germans once the US entered it in December 1941, and the invasion of the Soviet Union stalled in the snows of Russia that same winter. 1942 was the last year in which the possibility of German victory was in any way realistic, and by 1943 the Allies were going on the offensive on all fronts and pushing the Germans back towards Germany. After 2 further bitter years of death and destruction, it finally came to an end in May 1945, days after the Führer killed himself in Berlin. With the war over, the Allies divided Germany into 4 different zones of occupation, controlled by the Soviets, British, French and Americans. Eventually the French, British and American zones in the West and South would be formed into a US-aligned West Germany in the Cold War, while East Germany emerged as part of the Soviet Warsaw Pact behind the Iron Curtain. Strasser sensed an opportunity for himself in post-war West Germany and repeatedly petitioned the various Allied governments in the late 1940s and early 1950s to be allowed to return home to Bavaria. These requests were generally refused. Strasser did not aid his case by persistently publishing papers about a post-war reconstruction of Germany which would allow it to take its place amongst the more powerful European nations, arguing that the best way to avoid a new war in the future was to create a Germany along the lines of the 1938 Greater Germany that the Nazis had created through the union with Austria and the annexation of the Sudetenland in Czechoslovakia. This was all fantasy. There was never any way that the Allies would consent to allowing a Greater Germany to emerge after the Nazis had obliterated much of the continent. These ideas delayed Strasser's return to Germany, but eventually in the course of the 1950s, as the war crimes tribunals ended, and as many former Nazis were quickly pardoned and reintegrated into the West German government in order to help the US and its allies fight the Soviets in Central Europe, Strasser was given leave to return home in 1952. In the end, it would be early 1955 before Strasser returned to Germany, as the courts in the West German capital Bonn appealed the decision in 1952 and prevented his homecoming for another 2.5 years. He headed first for Switzerland, where he was photographed in February 1955, visiting his wife and grown children in Zurich, who he had left behind in the Alpine country 15 years earlier. Upon his arrival in Germany on the 18th of March 1955, he was greeted by a bevy of journalists at Frankfurt Airport and interviewed by a large number of media outlets which were curious to learn what this surviving scion of the National Socialism of the 1920s intended to do back in his homeland. He made clear his intention to re-enter politics, stating that he believed that Germany needed to fight to be independent of, quote, the Kremlin and Wall Street, emphasizing his dual anti-communist and anti-capitalist views. His residual anti-Semitism was also on display. By April 1955, the Jewish Telegraphic Agency, a leading Israeli media outlet, was reporting second-hand on interviews Strasser had with German newspapers, such as the Frankfurter Allgemeine, in which he had stated that Germany's Jewish people, as small as their numbers were in the post-war period, would have to fully assimilate or face being stripped of their German citizenship, stating that otherwise they should be classed in the same way a German traveling on a passport to Israel would be. Exactly what Strasser meant by assimilation was not entirely clear, but it was a worrying portent of the return of this anti-Semitic campaigner to post-war Germany. Back in Germany, Strasser's life took on a slightly pathetic veneer. He settled in Munich, living for a time with his sister Olga. By then his children were grown, and there was no real need to reconstitute his family life in some vague fashion after years of exile in Canada. He began touring the country widely, trying to make himself a significant voice on the topic of post-war Germany, arguing that West Germany was nothing more than a US colony. In some senses, he was not entirely incorrect. The post-war settlement had deliberately tied the economies of West Germany and Japan to the US dollar, in the belief that the best way to avoid another war and to reform these nations was not to punish them, but to make sure they prospered economically, an approach which was enormously successful. Often he spoke of the racial problems of Germany in somewhat guarded language. It was clear that the Nazism in him had not gone away. Strasser's efforts to return to a prominent position within German politics were lackluster in the extreme. In 1956, shortly after he returned to Bavaria, he established the German Social Union. The party was founded in a clear effort to reunite the fragments of the National Socialism of the 1920s and 1930s into a political movement which would garner support from unreformed Nazi elements. Early meetings were characterized by brawls and individuals who showed up to heckle Strasser and his few followers rather than to join the nascent movement. When elections were held in 1957, the party was so chaotically managed that it failed to put forward a single candidate to run. It would continue to exist for another 5 years before it fizzled out in 1962. Ultimately, Strasser was out of line with the times. When the post-war reconstruction and the war crimes trials and imprisonments were all taken into account, West Germany was only barely beginning to recover from the Nazi abomination by the early 1950s. The last thing that anyone wanted was one of its oldest figures arriving back to Germany and attempting to reincarnate National Socialism. By the mid-1960s, Strasser had largely accepted that he would be unable to launch some new and successful form of Nazism. He therefore returned to his writing instead. We might consider his post-war publishing efforts to be a corollary to the myth of the clean Wehrmacht, which many former leading generals of the German military were propagating in the late 1940s, 1950s, and into the 1960s. These sought to argue that the Wehrmacht had been following in the traditions of honor-bound Prussian generals and had not been responsible for the worst crimes of the Nazi regime, an argument which has proven to be comprehensively false since then. Similarly, Strasser tried to create a myth of the clean National Socialist movement, one which argued that Nazism was relatively benign in the 1920s until Hitler and his cronies corrupted it. Otto wrote extensively on this topic and also produced a new autobiography, which would be his most comprehensive memoir. Oddly, he gave this work, which appeared in print in 1968, the title Mein Kampf, My Struggle, the very same title as Hitler's political manifesto of the mid-1920s. Whether he was being ironic or trying to drum up publicity in an age which had forgotten about Otto Strasser is uncertain. In any event, despite the provocative title, the book generated little attention and has not been studied much since. A year later, struggling financially, Strasser unsuccessfully tried to appeal to the West German courts for a state pension on the grounds that he had worked extensively for Germany for many years as one of the leaders of the resistance to the Nazis. His appeal was rejected, with the decision affirming that Strasser had been a Nazi himself and so was not an opponent of the regime, just someone who was involved in a personal dispute with Hitler. 5 years later, on the 27th of August 1975, he died in Munich at 76 years of age. His obituary in the New York Times noted that he had died in obscurity, though interestingly described him as Hitler's Trotsky, comparing him to Leon Trotsky, the potential successor to Vladimir Lenin as head of the Soviet Union in the 1920s, one who had become the nemesis of Joseph Stalin in exile. Strasser's death did not bring an end to attempts to rejuvenate far-right politics in West Germany. The National Democratic Party of Germany, a neo-Nazi organization and a successor to the German Reich Party, had already been set up during Otto's lifetime and continued to operate in German politics after unification, despite periodic efforts to ban it. That said, radical politics in West Germany in the 1970s and 1980s was dominated by far-left groups such as the Red Army faction, often colloquially referred to as the Baader-Meinhof group, after its two main leaders, Andreas Baader and Ulrike Meinhof. These associated more with Maoism. The contradictions of German extremist politics, which the Strassers in some ways epitomized, continued through members of the Red Army faction, with Horst Mahler, a prominent member of the Baader-Meinhof group in the 1970s, having become a far-right neo-Nazi and a member of the National Democratic Party in the early 2000s. More worrying signs of Germany's growing reception of extremist politics began around the time of German reunification. In the 1989 European Parliament elections, the Republikaner Partei, or REP, garnered 2 million votes under Franz Schönhuber, an unapologetic former member of the Waffen-SS, the most radical branch of the Nazi paramilitary units and one which ran the concentration camp system across Europe. Otto Strasser is an ambiguous character. He and his brother Gregor represented a different form of National Socialism in Germany in the 1920s, one which was more left-leaning than the right wing of the party represented by Adolf Hitler. Theirs was a form of Nazism which placed more of an emphasis on socialism than nationalism. In the second half of the 1920s, they fought a major battle to try and steer the party in a different direction, to the cult of personality that Hitler was intent on turning it into. Had they been successful in this, it is possible that the history of Europe and the world in the middle of the 20th century could have been considerably different. Nevertheless, this shouldn't lead us to view Strasser as a benign opponent of Hitler. A convinced anti-Semite and a staunch nationalist, he was still a Nazi. Ultimately, that he managed to rehabilitate his own reputation in international circles was owing to a complex series of events, beginning with his split with Hitler and decision to head into exile, followed by his vocal opposition to Hitler while abroad between 1933 and 1945. These efforts to set himself apart from the ruling Nazi leadership were compounded by his own self-promotion through his books, and also efforts by the British government to utilize Strasser to foment anti-Hitler revolts in Germany during the war. The latter revolts failed, but Strasser was significantly successful in presenting himself during his lifetime as the face of an alternative form of National Socialism. What do you think of Otto Strasser? Did he represent a more moderate strain of National Socialism, or has his legacy and reputation simply been burnished by his opposition to Hitler, regardless of his own political views and ideology? Please let us know in the comment section. And in the meantime, thank you very much for watching.